Oh, the Soviet Union, a source of mystery, intrigue, and endless suffering and disaster. And yes, I'm looking at you, Anatoly Dyatlov, because the fall of the Soviet Union was certainly a monumental fall for one of America's largest geopolitical rivals. It marked a monumental collapse and shocked the world, as the Iron Curtain, a longtime staple of the USSR, had largely shielded the regime from much outside scrutiny from Western prying eyes.
After 6 years of Gorbachev's liberalizing reforms, the Soviet Union is falling apart.
But oddly enough, the USSR's collapse was the first televised governmental collapse in history, as millions around the world watched as Boris Yeltsin emerged on television declaring the Soviet regime obsolete and taking charge of the new country to become known as the Russian Federation. It was a shocking moment in the world as one of America's biggest enemies came crashing down like a sack of Russian potatoes. And almost 35 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Russian Federation finds itself in another perilous economic situation as Putin's war in Ukraine drags on for the third year. Ukraine is mounting an unprecedented operation to strike Russian energy sites, primarily Russian oil and gas, as Western sanctions grip the economy in a chokehold. And on the battlefield, Ukraine and Russia are gridlocked, with neither side making significant gains in months. This is already bad enough for Russia's failing economy, but NATO's developed a cunning plan, which is to be fully set in motion starting this month. NATO plans to destroy the Russian economy from the top down, essentially creating an environment which will force Putin to make one of two choices: negotiate on America's terms to end the war, or take the Russian people to the depths of hell with him. By undertaking this plan, the West is taking a significant gamble. Putin's already proven that he's allowing his ego to guide his decision-making in Ukraine, and none of Putin's advisors are willing to speak out against the war in Ukraine out of fear of falling from a 10-story window in central Moscow. And as seen near the beginning of the war, most of Putin's so-called advisors are scared to even speak as their loyalty is tested by the dictator Putin himself.
Значит, в противном случае вы предлагаете начать переговорный процесс?
Нет, я...
Или признавать суверенитет.
А я
Говорите прямо.
Я поддержу предложение о признании...
Поддержу или поддерживаю? Говорите прямо, Сергей.
Поддерживаю предложение.
Так и скажите, да или нет.
As you can see, Putin's spy chief Sergei Naryshkin is stuttering and tripping over his words as he desperately tries to find the right words to avoid finding himself out of a job and, quite frankly, out of a life. With Putin's advisors unwilling to speak out and powerful Russian oligarchs equally terrified, that leaves Putin's power unchecked and dangerously reckless. And this is what makes the West's plan to destroy the economy risky, but nonetheless a necessary risk in the eyes of Western decision makers. NATO's plan consists of three crucial components, with the first of which being to apply maximum sanctions to the Russian oil and gas industry, and then following that up with the Ukrainian attacks on mainland Russian oil facilities, and finally waiting for the collapse to trigger a cascade effect throughout the Russian economy. The West has already begun to implement steps 1 and 2, and on January the 10th, the first round of these so-called extreme sanctions went into effect and targeted the largest oil companies in Russia. This round of sanctions was wide-ranging and started the process of applying maximum sanctions to Russia with the goal of starving Russia of the ability to export oil and gas to Western-aligned countries. This part of the plan was outlined in the confirmation hearings of the incoming U.S. administration.
If any officials in the Russian Federation are watching this confirmation hearing, they should know that if I'm confirmed, and as part of his strategy to end the Ukraine war, that I will be 100% on board for taking sanctions up, especially on the Russian oil majors, to levels that would bring the Russian Federation to the table.
In theory, these extreme sanctions are designed to bring Russia to the negotiating table faster, but this will depend on if Russia is able to bypass these sanctions, as they have attempted to accomplish by using a shadow fleet of foreign-flagged vessels. However, the extreme nature of the 2025 sanctions will prove this to be a difficult task for Russia, because not only are Western countries drastically reducing their consumption of Russian energy, but now China and India have recently denied Russian ships to dock at their ports and sell Russian natural gas to comply with U.S. sanctions on the Russian Federation. Also, Poland has announced that they will be reducing Russian gas imports by 80% in 2025. For example, these sanctions are already showing their effectiveness, as Gazprom, one of Russia's largest energy companies, has announced a plan to lay off over 1,500 employees as they try to stave off financial ruin. Other energy companies are also showing signs of distress, including Russia's largest energy company, Rosneft. The ruling elite class of Russia, known as oligarchs, are already feeling the pressure on their wallets wallets and have begun pressuring Putin to speed the war up so that their companies don't collapse beneath their feet. This is a clear sign that a rift may be forming between the businessmen of Russia and the Putin regime. And since energy exports account for over 20% of the GDP of Russia's economy, this will form a cascading effect which will impact almost every sector of the Russian economy, such as banking and the services industry. Economists have also stated that Russia is beginning to experience an economic crisis known as stagflation, which is essentially a period of high inflation, low economic growth, and high unemployment. To give an example of how detrimental stagflation could prove to the Russian economy, the Soviet Union also experienced stagflation starting around the 1980s, and the USSR subsequently collapsed only 11 years later in 1991. But that wasn't even a wartime economy, which makes Russia's situation much more perilous and could result in a much faster collapse than what was witnessed during the fall of the Soviet Union. Also, in recent weeks, Ukraine has increased drone attacks on Russian oil and gas facilities exponentially to add another layer of damage to Russia's energy sector on top of American sanctions. These attacks usually target Russia's largest refineries and can knock out the producing capacity of these plants for weeks. It also forces Russian energy companies to make costly repairs to their facilities, which they cannot afford to make due to their perilous economic situation. Ukraine is conducting these attacks day in and day out at a pace which Russia cannot afford to keep up with. And despite Russian claims that advanced air defense have been moved into the area of the oil facilities, these Ukrainian attacks are largely successful, and this combined with American sanctions has the ability to tear the Russian economy down, but the real question is, how long is that going to take? And that is the third and most unpredictable step of NATO's plan, which is simply sitting back and waiting. This part is arguably the most difficult part of the plan, and actually, NATO is not sitting back at all, and instead, it's actively preparing for war with Russia. This is due to the fact that the plan to destroy Russia's economy has an inherent risk. If Putin feels he is losing grip on his power and that his influence is slipping, he might end up launching a war on NATO states or potentially use nuclear weapons in Ukraine.
Тем, кто позволяет себе такие заявления в отношении России, хочу напомнить, что наша страна также располагает различными средствами поражения, а по отдельным компонентам и более современными, чем у стран НАТО. И при угрозе территориальной целостности нашей страны для защиты России и нашего народа мы, безусловно, используем все имеющиеся в нашем распоряжении средства. Это не блеф.
After all, a cornered animal can be dangerous, and that would be the position in which Putin finds himself. Or will everything go according to plan and Putin will simply come to the negotiating table and end the war on America's terms? Signs indicate that Putin may be preparing for both options, as he seems to be amassing more troops than are needed to fight the Ukraine war. And according to German Major General Christian Freuding, he warns that Russia is amassing forces that exceed the requirements of the current conflict in Ukraine, and that Russia is creating conditions for an attack on NATO in the coming years. Also, Russian spokesman Dmitry Peskov has stated that the Kremlin does not believe there will be much progress made at the negotiating table, but they remain open to talks if America is willing to meet their demands. Meanwhile, Putin continues to threaten the West with possible nuclear war if his demands to permanently restrict Ukraine from joining NATO are not met. This leaves NATO in a position where they must prepare for both options, both war and diplomacy. NATO leaders have consistently warned that member states must prepare for the possibility that Russia will become desperate enough to launch an ill-fated war against NATO, and they must prepare immediately. NATO has also ramped up their military exercises to test NATO alliance readiness against Russian forces, with the most recent of which being the Steadfast Defender exercise in 2024. Steadfast Defender 24 was NATO's largest military exercise since the Cold War. Whatever the case may be, NATO's plan will be carried out in 2025, and with no end to the Ukraine war seemingly in sight, this new plan to destroy the Russian economy is seemingly the only viable option to bring Russia to its knees in the hope that the war will be forced to end. It's also unclear how Russia will respond to this plan, but 2025 will likely prove to be the year that Russia's resolve will be tested to the extreme. Thank you all for watching, and please remember to like and subscribe and check out our main channel, The Enforcer, for more daily war updates from Ukraine and around the world. I'm Enforcer Matt, and I'll see you all in the next one.